Alright, everybody, welcome to another game design dev chat here on the Game Wisdom channel. I am Josh Placer, and we have another very fascinating discussion about trying to explain game design elements and mechanics. Joining me is fan of the site, frequent guest, and designer on Epic Tavern, Tomo Moriwaki. How are you doing?
Good. How's it going, folks? Glad to be here.
It's great to have you back on. How are things going with Epic?
Things are moving along. We are likely to deploy a patch, which we haven't been able to really pull off in a bit of time, quite possibly today. And so there are a number of announcements on Steam and stuff that are revolving around that, and we'll see if we actually get the patch out.
Nice. And we certainly have a very interesting chat for our little discussion. This was something that I pitched as a video, and I know you were very interested in discussing this as well, especially with your background. You, of course, worked on Spider-Man 2 back in the day, a very action-heavy game, and now with Epic Tavern, that is more of an abstracted, almost like a turn-based kind of feel to it. And
Yeah.
as we were just talking about before we turned the stream on, when most people think about feel when it comes to a video game, they immediately turn to action games. For those of you who missed the thumbnail, I have, of course, Dark Souls and Dante from Devil May Cry 3 in there. And that's what a lot of people think about when we say, this feel. How does the game feel in the player's hands? So, I'm going to toss this over to you first. So, when we talk about game feel, what immediately comes to your mind?
So, back in the day, as a player, I definitely like games like Devil May Cry, Ninja Gaiden, all the Street Fighter stuff. If you remember back far enough, there's probably a shotgun in Syndicate that might be noteworthy and memorable, maybe because its audio was just turned up too loud when you shot it. There are all these examples over the course of our playing experiences where turning up a response to 11 contributed to it being memorable and really adding to the positive elements of the experience. And we know in fight games that if there isn't a feeling of impact, there isn't a feeling of playing. There are the odd number of fight games out there that are really soft or weak in terms of the way they convey impact, and they have a real hard time succeeding. And some games that may not be constructed so well pull off the impact so intensely that it's really hard not to be kind of seduced or won over by the game just at a visceral level. And so I think from a development standpoint, throughout the course of my career, myself and my peers have always found the impact through VFX and sound and timing to be one of the most important kind of underlying or foundational elements of what we do from day to day from a design standpoint.
Yeah, and I would definitely put getting the feel of your game up there as one of those distinctions that kind of separate good designers from expert or master level design, because it is something I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about on more, I would say, more on the consumer side, but you feel it when it's there and you feel it when it's not there, kind of thing. And like you said, some games just don't feel right. I know we're going to be using the word feel a lot for this conversation, but you can tell when something's off when it comes to the feel or the responsiveness of a game.
And I just want to say, I don't know if I agree with the kind of master description in terms of design. I think that it is definitely a very important category. It exists in its own bubble. It can be seen as one of the important subjects. And if someone is going to be making a spreadsheet game, there may be little or no need of that skill set. However, that skill set will always find a way to express itself in a way to benefit almost any product, I think.
Yeah. And for the back half, when we get to it for this cast, we're going to be talking about turn-based or abstracted games and how we can apply these lessons. Because like we said, if you're making an idle game or a turn-based RPG, you're not really thinking about that visceral impact or the feel of the controls. But as we're going to probably talk about, you can still, I think, derive some lessons from action-based games for this kind of impact or feel.
Oh, I totally agree. In fact, maybe one way of putting it is that the impact we feel, we could use something as simple as like the hit spark and the animation
Mm-hmm.
reaction and the sound of a fighting game where you hit somebody.
Mm-hmm.
That is a piece of feedback. It's a communication to the player. It's not ultimately at its core. It's not different than your UI making sense,
Mm-hmm.
or you having an elegant set of choices based on the kinds of results you get in a game. It is in some regards, it is some kind of it's a deeply elemental part of what it means to make an experience for someone else.
Yeah. And as you were saying with fighting games and the beat 'em up genre in particular, this is one thing that I've noticed a lot. Like for a lot of our indie spotlights and games that people send me, beat 'em ups are still being made by plenty of indie developers. And one of the things I notice almost immediately is when there's not that really good sense of feedback. When you punch an enemy and they don't react, or you hit the guy and it's just like the same canned response again and again. And like we can go as far back as games like Final Fight, Streets of Rage, even something like what I played recently with Fight and Rage, Way of the Pacifists. That there is that sense of impact. There's that, I'm not sure what the exact term I want to use. There's that heft or that weight that you
Yeah.
can feel when you're attacking an enemy.
I've heard people call it juiciness. I've heard people
Yeah.
call it oomph. Impact is kind of like my generic universal way of putting it.
Hmm.
I bet with a little bit of study or analysis, we could probably come up with a better generic term, though.
Yeah. And like you were saying, it is part of gameplay, but it's a lot of like the aesthetics and kind of the art and sound that really can add to the impact, especially when we talk about action heavy games. Um, One of my favorites I want to bring up for this discussion is from Devil May Cry 5. And what they did in one of those, and I think this is going to be kind of like a running theme for this talk, that the very best games that do this, it doesn't seem like out of place or very apparent. It always seems to be kind of like an underlining element of the game. Like you said a few minutes ago, it wouldn't be considered like grandmaster design the same way as making a an over the top or amazing level or a solid progression curve. But it's one of those things that it's very hard to do right, and it's almost like not noticeable when you do it right because people it just becomes so intrinsic to the experience. And with Devil May Cry 5, did you have a chance to play that one?
Or just a tiny bit, but yeah, a little bit.
All right. What they did was that the music that plays during combat is dynamic based on how well you play the game. So if you're like D or F rank, it's like very basic. There's not a lot of sound to it. If you get up to a double S or triple S rating, it just gets full on metal orchestral music that's playing while you're trying to fight all these demons.
That's awesome. Yeah, and those. I mean, one way of thinking about it, just in general, is that they're just increased number of channels or number of channels and intensity of channels
Yes.
to give you more variables to track or to feel. Right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
you can think of almost all of these things as they don't change the message. They just improve the clarity of that message.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of a fighting game, how do you communicate with everything in the world around you? By hitting it,
Yeah.
and or trying to avoid getting hit by it, and sometimes getting hit by it. So those things all need to be super clear, and that it be enjoyable somehow or attractive. It seems very obvious that that would then be desirable by anyone making any game.
Mm-hmm. And while when we talk about this kind of feel, a lot of it doesn't have direct gameplay implications, but I think in some cases, if the feel of your game is off, it can affect the actual gameplay. And
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think
yeah,
it affects the speed or the
yeah,
rate at which you develop skill. Because if it's well crafted, it draws you to pay attention to the right things quicker, and it gives you positive feedback for doing things right, so you want to do it harder or better. I
yeah.
think it does a very good job of that.
Yeah. And that's why for the thumbnail I included Gundyr from Dark Souls 3, because Dark Souls is a game that, and I'm going to get your thoughts on this as well as a chat, like, it's not as kinetic as some of the action games we've talked about. It's a very, whenever I describe Souls-like games or that kind of design, I call it very methodical. You're not button mashing, it's not supposed to be super high-speed play. But one of the things I think separates good and bad Souls likes is kind of, I guess, displaying that heft of how combat works. It's not just just like, wildly swing a dagger or swing a sword. Like, the character, winds up. You can see, like, the entire animation. I think that's another big part about this, is getting the animation right. That's not.
Absolutely.
And that obviously has hitbox issues as well. That is a major part of the hitbox. If you can't see or properly track an attack, there's no way you're going to dodge or defend or oppose that in time.
And well, if we think about the objective of these kinds of, or this kind of thinking or this kind of work, it's there to communicate information, and it under all circumstances, in my opinion, if you concentrate information, it's better. It's richer. It's more flavorful. So when things happen in smaller time frames but have much bigger magnitudes, it's like a burst of flavor, and that's very noteworthy. It's very attractive and interesting. And so in a lot of ways, some of this impact is just kind of some of the basic rules that attract our attention and make us interested. Like if there was a hit impact sound that sounded like pooh. You don't know where. I mean, if it doesn't come on hard, you kind of don't know when to grab it. You don't know what moment it means the impact is happening. Whereas that all alone already gets more going on, and we hear it, and it's more interesting. There's a ton of like really elemental human response stuff going on with this, and so therefore the animation is of course essential. Is what I meant to say.
Yeah. And with something like with a Souls-like, there's also, as you said, like that kind of feedback or the hit detection. Like if you hit an enemy and you can stun them, or you knock them out of their attack, you need that kind of animation or that sound to convey that. Because if you don't have that, and this is something I see from a lot of lesser action games, that they either hide it or it's very hard to tell if an enemy is stunned. So if you keep attacking them and they're not stunned, guess what? They're going to just smack you while you're in the middle of your combo. And then it feels like the game is betraying, I think, the player's senses.
Yeah. And maybe I would describe it more as failing to really grab their senses, right? Because it's not it is the absence of success that you're describing as a betrayal, but ultimately it just simply becomes, we gave it a shot, we didn't quite get there.
So while we've been talking about fighting and beat 'em up style games, what would you say would be good feel? Because I have a few ideas of this myself. When we talk about platformers or like 2D style games that are more about, like, let's say motion or movement as opposed to direct combat.
Well, I don't think it necessarily matters if it's about motion or combat, right? What ends up the game that's being played is, I'm conveying to you through intensity kind of a hierarchy of results. So if your light punch shouldn't feel like it has more oomph than your heavy punch, but if your light punch doesn't feel like it has any punch, then it doesn't feel good. And so in some ways, step one is, what is the minimum amount of oomph I can add to a thing to make you pay attention and make you like it more, knowing that I might have 7 other levels of intensity that I want to present. Now, if we get to the 6th level of intensity and it ends up feeling the same as the 7th, that's not so bad. It's not the end of the world. I could have used up my dynamic range that way, and some people might be a little disappointed, like they feel somewhere in their soul that the 7th, the most powerful impact, is just not quite isn't that satisfying. Now, on the other hand, though, if the first attack, if the 2nd through the 7th attack all had basically the same intensity at that point, now there's a lot more sort of kind of like latent disappointment at the experience. It's that I can't tell the difference. I can't tell the difference between 2 and 7, at least not the same way as I can when I'm playing Street Fighter, in that the big hits make, a number of games where the big hits are really well crafted, and it like makes you feel like your nose is going to bleed.
Mm-hmm.
You can't walk away from those games having not felt something, right? There is stuff going on there, and it's reaching into the way your responses work and what makes you feel and what makes you pay attention.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the feel of a game, part of it is what can you do, and what can you do. And so, like in some ways, like a hierarchy or a ranked arrangement of player actions, and then lining those up with a dynamic range of expressing impact. Now, let's say I'm very bad at this. Maybe I don't have much range of impact that I can express. I just don't know it well enough. Maybe I'm not even thinking about it, right? Or that if I am thinking about it, I'm doing it in a disorganized way.
Mm-hmm.
So now the game design effort is know what you want the player to do, and you want to know how they want. You don't want them to have a intuitive understanding of the relative weights or impact of things, and then play that into your capability of expressing a range of impact. And if you're doing your job right and clear, then those things line up well. And the better you are at one or the other, the better you are at kind of understanding the nuanced differences between the actions that are available to the player. That'll allow you to line them up better into your ability to create a dynamic range of impacts.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's kind of where it all boils down. Somewhere in your game is the biggest boom or the biggest bang or noteworthy impact for the player. And I would say that something to keep in mind is don't make that only happen once. It's a very satisfying thing. You might want to use up your kind of most of your dynamic range of impact sort of early and have special custom things for the bigger things that are very, very infrequent.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of Spider-Man, like we had three ranges of hit impact sparks, and then we had a policy in the way we handled hit animations, and then we made use of time dilation tools to kind of scale and have there be a range of different results.
And as you're describing that, it made me think about what they do with the power-ups in a Mario game. That whenever you pick up a power-up in Mario, you get the little sound, you get, the little growth animation, Mario changes his model, etc. And then, of course, when you get the invincibility star, that's when they just go all out. The music starts playing, he's flashing. Sometimes they change, in a few games, they actually change Mario's jump animation. And it becomes like that kind of spectacle for the player. We something in Sonic, too. How many people love when Sonic goes.
Sound distortion there.
Yeah, okay, there you go. But yeah, like that kind of.
You were saying something about Sonic, and I didn't quite catch that.
Okay. When you become invincible as Sonic and the music changes, he's, covered in stars and he's just, demolishing everything.
Yeah, I mean, and just as a note, Nintendo has always been excellent at all of this, and
Mm-hmm.
not even in a goes to 11
Excellent
sort of
at
way.
all
Just
of it.
elegant, impactful, clear. It can convey many different kinds of feelings through their impact. It's really good,
Mm-hmm.
and from the very beginning too.
Yeah. I mean, even that simple act, again, another famous example, Mario making his little noises when he jumps.
Those three sounds. Yep.
Yeah, the ha, ha. Like, again, how many, that is ingrained in our memories forever, with Mario making that kind of noise whenever he does his triple jump. And, again, like, this kind of stuff, it sounds so simple. Just add noises to your game, it will magically feel better. But it's getting it all to be proper that is very hard to do. We are talking about feedback and making a game feel good in the player's hands track. And right now we're focusing on action or, player focus gameplay.
Yeah.
Now, there's one thing that I want to ask you, and I'm going to throw this to the chat as well. I've seen a lot of games, especially from the independent space, that one of the ways they try to convey feel is that they'll do like a quick screen pause every time you kill an enemy. If you played Enter the Gungeon, they make use of that pretty much immediately. Like every time you kill an enemy, the screen it just like kind of stops for like a almost like a quarter of a second, maybe even just like a millisecond or two. And I know they're trying to make the game like feel good. They're trying to like give that sense like, oh, you killed an enemy, something happened. But I always find that, at least for me, it'd be like off-putting. Like it feels like I'm being like taken out of playing the game because the screen just keeps like pausing every time I kill an enemy.
Time dilation is one of the trickiest things to get right.
Mm-hmm.
In Spider-Man, we made extensive use of it, and I feel like one of the things that you do, one thing you never do is in one frame drop to 0 time speed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that will always feel like too great a discontinuity.
Yeah.
But we would do a thing where over the course of maybe like just a handful of frames, ramp the speed down to 5%, and then quickly ramp it back. Now, a slow ramp to stop is never going to feel like impact. Impact, all of the forms of impact rely entirely on contrast. So from one moment to the next, the bigger the marginal change is, the more you're going to start to be able to be kind of transferring a feeling of impact to the audience. But there are limits to that, of course. If you would have dead silence and then just blast maximum volume static, that'll have a lot of impact. It might not make your player happy though.
Yeah. And as you're talking about like time dilation, it reminded me of something like Fear and what they did with I think they would call the guy Point Man, whatever his name is. He has his whole ability to slow down time. And one of the things that they did really well there is that it's not just things slowed down, so you can actually hear like the guy, you can hear like the sound slow of your bullets. Like it's all about that immersion, I think.
And the way we experience things, it turns out, is never really like, you can't just slow time down globally. It doesn't quite feel right because the sounds don't slow down quite enough, or the people or the things slow down too much. The more you can have different tracks of time dilation in your world, the more you can tune things to where they need to be. And sometimes you don't even tune them. You just maybe change the asset. Like sound could be a fine example where you record something slow and treat it in a way as to fit better with that experience. Granted, I think in our case with Spider-Man, we just were able to tune those two things down separately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as we've been talking, and I think Draken brought up. Oh no, you brought up the shotgun in Medal of Honor. When we talk about shotguns, one of the best examples of feel in the game, I think, of this decade or last decade will of course be Doom 2016, and that sense of heft as we've described it as the Doom Marine was one of the key aspects of it.
Yeah, shotgun sound is probably ground zero for our industry kind of learning the ropes on this kind of stuff. That's why I brought up that the Syndicate shotgun.
Yeah.
If you go back and listen to it, there's something almost like there's something wrong with it.
I always think about the original Doom shotgun as well, that meatiness of it.
Yeah. Even the basic shotgun felt great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man.
Doom. I haven't been keeping up with Doom well enough.
Yeah, that like to Draken's comment about Doom 2016 versus Doom Eternal. It's a very interesting point of contention because it's one thing that I've seen that a lot of people have been complaining about was just like how different the feel of Doom Eternal is, both from its UI and just kind of like more the how they're approaching the storytelling of that one. And like I think that goes in a way to Dino's point about like that kind of like that fight between realism and immersion, or realism and cuteness, or like cartoony, I think could be the right term when we're talking about the feel of the game.
Yeah, I think that there's like we could have probably there's room for a long amount of conversation and study with how you can create the visual effects of carnage in a more realistic versus less realistic environment.
Hmm.
I mean, from my perspective, Doom 2016 was ultimately a little too pushing the realistic look a bit too hard,
Hmm.
and maybe constraining some of its expressiveness. Now, to be fair, I'm saying that in hindsight because it doesn't have the same impact than the id titles from before.
Hmm.
They kind of in many ways kind of invented a lot of the first person shooter impact kind of lexicon, and people have been working off of that or from that ever since. But in Doom 2016, I felt like they were making this kind of fidelity play that, at the time at least, I had some contempt for. I think in hindsight, I find both these games to be pretty interesting. I mean, I,
Hmm.
I do feel like Doom Eternal is gonna try to bring the gameplay vibe back a little harder. I'm not sure, of course, because I haven't played it.
Me either. Yeah, it's on my list, and I think that's a very interesting point. Again, what Dino's bringing up about that weird. I'm not sure what the term I want to use. Almost like the contradiction or contradictory elements when we talk about realism and kind of like the fantasy side of things, because it's something that I've seen a lot. Like when we look at games that go for extreme violence and extreme disturbing nature, the more unrealistic it looks, the more palpable it is to the player. Like I've seen people talk about Doom Eternal that you're ripping eyeballs out, you're ripping guys' arms. It's a lot more visceral from like the glory kills in Doom Eternal than they are in Doom 2016. But nobody's really complaining about the hardcore violence because it is presented as essentially a cartoon. Same thing goes for stuff like Hotline Miami, or of course something
Right.
like what was the name of it? I think DEF CON by Introversion. This was a game that was about a thermonuclear war, where they can flash on screen. You just killed 8 billion people, and
Totally.
nobody really cares because it's just static text on a screen.
Well, I think that there's just different choices that you have to make, and I think
Hmm.
those choices can be mismatched. So if we took kind of some of my experience in Medal of Honor 2010
Hmm.
as one example, its goals were very much one of realism and authenticity. We spent a lot of energy and time and iteration kind of having bullets hit bodies and having them fall to the
Hmm.
ground in more realistic ways. We were trying to not have animations where you have arms flailing and people flying as a result of taking rounds, and instead doing that kind of icky kind of
That's
sinking
subtle.
thing where they
Yeah.
just shudder a bit and then slump to the ground because we were trying to get impact in that particular way, right? So if your game's theme is going to become more realistic, part of the pact you're making with your audience is you're going to depict things in more realistic ways because that's where you want to get your impact, or that's the way you want to get it. And then, if you take something like Bulletstorm, for example, obviously
I was
it's
going to
taking
bring that
100%
up.
the other route. Where we just want to go to 11, and if we want to go to 11, then I need to be able to, maybe what I need to be able to do is show the ghost of a monkey slamming cymbals together up in the sky while your head's exploding.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought Bulletstorm because I was thinking about that for this discussion. Like, Bulletstorm is one of my favorite first person shooters for that very fact that it is nothing about realism. As you said, they tore the knob off at 11, and that's where it kept from beginning to the end of the game. And it is kind of difficult. Like, as you were describing Medal of Honor, like it reminded me of something like Soldier of Fortune, the game that was heavily criticized for its modeling. Like this was, I think, what was it, like 2000? I think it was early thousands. Like the first Soldier of Fortune game came out, and the game was criticized for the fact that it had full deformation of the models. Like you could shoot somebody in the arm, their arm gets destroyed. And of course, this was early 3D graphics, but it unsettled a lot of people who play that.
That demo on that train was magical. That was crazy. They definitely took dismemberment to the next level.
Yeah.
And I get it. I mean, actually, I didn't get it at the time because at the time I played it. that kind of reminds me of the controversy around No Russian.
Ah, yes.
Because when you watch the video of No Russian, which was my first experience, I'm like, whoa, that's crossing the line. And then the moment I played, I'm like, it's just a video game, whatever.
Yeah. And I think like with this discussion about feel, it's ultimately about I think like that immersion, the immersion of bringing the player into this game space. Like it feels like I think in a way it's that the player feels like they're impacting the game, and like we said, like when the player feels like they're the ones in control of the game's responding to their actions, it makes it feel that much more immersive. And like you said, like with something like with No Russian, Bulletstorm, any game that really allows like when it puts the player, I think, in that role and lets them experience it like 100%, it can become, I think, very jarring for somebody who's not used to that.
Um, well, maybe one way to put it actually is that we have to do things to jar the user. We need to shock the audience. We need to do things that attract their attention, shake their perspective, wake them up, surprise them. All those things are things we need to do. And if we choose to do it in a language that doesn't match our game, then it is too disruptive, or it doesn't it loses some of its elegance, right? And it breaks some of the immersion. Whereas if we can keep to the form of the world we've established,
Mm-hmm.
then those things become amazing because it becomes like like it's a schoolyard fist fight with a bully and you hit them in the face and then suddenly it's like Scott Pilgrim against the world and you're like, this is the greatest thing ever.
Mm-hmm.
Or instead you do it and it becomes like this really realistic, horrific neck breaking and the kid falls to the ground twitching. And then you're like, I don't like this story so much anymore.
Yeah.
To be fair, some people might like that story. No judgment, but
Mm-hmm. Like as a bit of a tangent, like there's one of the things that I find like very annoying or like kind of puts me off of like a modern day Family Guy when they go for like these very like over the top, like brutal things. Like it just they go for like as realistic as they can do with the animation style. But they show like the skin tearing off. They show teeth. They show like the gums being ripped.
yeah, yeah. No, and it's I know a lot of people find it in bad taste,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes I do myself as well. But from the creative standpoint, what I see is actually just a type mismatch, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like I was kind of promising you I'd be speaking this language, and now I'm hitting you with this other language. And for some audiences that sometimes for those that know those creatives directly, sort of, they're
Yeah.
like, oh no, this is their jam. This is a dissonant interconnection of things that's their style. But for a normal audience that's not aware of that, it's just like this doesn't work for me. There's something messed up
You
about
pull
this.
the rug from out from under them, essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
Now
Oh,
we.
H. Draken made a comment about Call of Duty's Highway of Death
I
scene.
have
I
not seen that.
I found that really interesting story. The story is basically that they recreated a scene from I think Gulf War One,
Mm-hmm.
where a large number of vehicles that were trying to escape were destroyed by Allied bombers, basically. And I mean, there might have been some ground forces involved, but I don't think so. And so it was a humongous destruction and death toll of retreating military units and interspersed with non-military units. And at the time, it was seen as a big victory. But in recent times, Call of Duty kind of reimagined that event, but
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason, assigned blame to the Russians. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was the controversy there. It was an interesting choice on their part. Um, it's just kind of weird because it's changing. They're obviously making reference to something that's happened that did happen,
Mm-hmm.
and more importantly, it's kind of recent. So it was a strange choice. I don't really know the deal with that. My personal take on it is I have no problem with anything that is fictionalizing, military operations and just telling their story. It's just in that particular case, it's kind of hard to understand why the change
Mm-hmm.
from the Allied forces in Gulf War One versus Russian forces for whatever reason.
And that's, I think, a really good segue into the game that I wanted to bring up would be something like Spec Ops: The Line, that Spec Ops is probably one of the more famous third-person shooters that came out I think it was last decade or a little bit before that, for just how much they did pull the rug from out from underneath the player in terms of how they depicted military and American militarism.
Dude, that scene with the white phosphorus
Yes.
mortar, I am never going to forget that.
Oh
I mean,
yes.
to be fair, I would say that they handled it very well.
Hmm.
There's no way you're not going to offend people with that kind of a
Yeah.
scene, but I feel like they did a absolutely excellent job of depicting the horrors of warfare and the realities of the uncertainty you're dealing with when you're making certain choices, when you're trying to fight against an imagined enemy in this case, but an enemy nonetheless that you think you're doing the right thing by trying to win and survive. And holy crap, that scene with
Yeah.
the results of that white phosphorus fire
Hmm.
mission. It was devastating. I was very much put off balance and uncomfortable for the rest of the playthrough experience. And then when I got to the end, I was yet again more impressed with all the choices they made in their storytelling.
Hmm. And I think here's an interesting question for you and for the chat. Do you think, as a designer or as you're building the game, or even just explain to people, that you should, I think, convey what your game is supposed to feel, or do you think it's better, like with something like Spec Ops Line, to kind of leave it to the player to find, what kind of feeling that your game is going to be about?
I mean, that's kind of a tricky
Mm.
question, right? I mean, ultimately, everything the developer is doing is establishing the feel of the game. So, in so many ways, they're always saying it. Now, to be fair, you can do a bad job of that, and many games do. Very pretty much zero games do a perfect job of it, and maybe zero games do a perfectly terrible job of it.
Mhm.
But there's a whole range of developers expressing what what the feeling is of their game, and always to some extent kind of messing up a bit.
Mhm.
Um, but the games that get kind of close, you can feel it, right? Like when there is, it's in fact evidence that it is uncommon is when you play a game where all of its expressions are in alignment with each
Mhm.
other. You can feel it. You feel like this stability and concreteness to the experience, like its theme and the way you interact with it and the various results that can happen and the mechanics for controlling things. It's all in the same language. It feels really good.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to when I did my lecture about ARPG design. And one example of that kind of feel that was introduced last decade was the introduction of physics to how ragdoll physics, or almost like real time physics, in how enemies behave when they're killed. That sense that it's not just I swing a sword, guy falls down. It's I swing a sword, the enemy goes, flying 15 feet in the opposite direction. And it's that idea that, again, the player's actions are mattering to this world.
Yeah, I mean that makes a great deal of sense to me, and I do. I mean, sometimes you get excited about a feature, and
Hmm.
sometimes that feature doesn't perfectly match what players have been expecting. I think it depends maybe on the specific ARPG, I guess, right? But some ARPGs won't do good with
Hmm.
knocking a guy 15 feet.
Yeah.
For sure, Torchlight would have no problem with it, right?
Yeah.
Because of some of its stylistic approaches, and not even necessarily because of its story approach. Simply, its kind of tune shaded nature of its visuals would make a move like that not a no player would question it, right?
Hmm.
And then, but if somehow that would start happening, like in good old fashioned Titan Quest, for example, you'd be like, that's a little extreme. Why'd that happen?
Hmm. And I think that's one of the things that kind of put me off of Path of Exile, which if Ryu's watching, he's probably going to unsubscribe to the channel when I say this. That the feel of the skills just didn't have that same sense of heft to them playing Path of Exile as they did with Grim Dawn, with Diablo, and some of the other examples.
Well, I think Diablo has some room to go over the top.
Yeah.
But Grim Dawn, it's better when it's more austere and more kind of held to be a little more. It's a little more moderate.
Hmm.
There's something long term and gritty and realistic about the fantastical magical enemies of
Hmm.
Grim Dawn. But it's weird, right? It
Hmm.
you know it when you feel it and play it because there's so many things going on that are all coming together,
Hmm.
and it's not just one or two or any singular thing about a game that'll make something work or not work, right? It's this total messaging that the developers have to keep in mind, and that's probably why it's complicated and it's hard, and it's why no one ever gets it perfect,
Hmm.
because there's enough complexity there.
Yeah, but I think going back to what you were saying earlier about trying to get like the whole range of the actions to feel right. Oh, my voice is dying. All right, that's good. But that I think is one of the tougher aspects of this because, like you said, like within an RPG, if my basic attack causes the entire menu to explode in a mound of gibs and blood and destruction,
Yeah.
then it's just going to be like if everything does that, it's not going to feel right in my hands. But if you can make the normal attack feel good, your special attack feel good, your ultimate super screen clearing power feel good, then it's going to I think click more.
Yeah, and well, I mean, something with 10 units of power should be it should feel more powerful than something with 7 units of power. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, should it feel 10 over 7 as powerful? In a perfect world, yes. However, you know, ultimately impact is more than just one axis too, right? It could
Mm-hmm.
be that we would like it to have 10 units of physical force and 3 units of magical zoom. Whereas the other attack, we want it to have 7 units of force and have, 1 unit of mechanical clacker. There's as many axes to the expression as you build into it,
Mm-hmm.
and I think many a developer has high ambitions in the nuance of what they want to express, and we definitely hang ourselves with that rope pretty regularly.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's one more point about action-based field I want to bring up, and then I'll throw over to you, and then we'll move on to turn-based as well. That when we have, I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this in terms of action gameplay. Um, talk about feel. Talk about when it gets too far. Oh, here's what I want to bring up. What happens when it kind of overrides the experience? And what I mean by that is, earlier this year I was playing a Zombie Army 4. This is the kind of it's the zombie offshoot of the Sniper Elite series. And Sniper Elite has always been known for kind of it's a damage modeling. You don't just shoot a guy in the head. You watch the bullet slow mo. You see it enter. You see an X-ray of the bullet. Going through the character's brain, shooting out of the helmet, hitting the wall, or hitting somebody else behind them. It's obviously very gratuitous. It's very much that over-the-top feel to it. But when they switch to the zombie army kind of motif, you're not just fighting, individual enemies. You're fighting like 30, 50 enemies at a time. And to me, it kind of felt like it became that kind of over the top feel started to become distracting because it's basically I'm trying to kill enemies. Also, we gotta stop for a 10-second glory kill. Back to it, we start killing again. We have another 10-second stop.
I feel like as long as your game is called Sniper Elite, that's kind of okay,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the difference between this game and the other games. In any other game, obviously that's just flat out problematic. Like it's like I wasn't playing a game to get interrupted every 20 seconds,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now this whole sniper genre, I don't know if ever, I don't think people thought that could be its own thing until
Yeah.
last maybe 10 or 15 years. And certainly Sniper Elite started earlier than that, and they forced it to work. I think they've been at it for a good long time. But um, they benefit, right, because of the overall reality of their game. They can do a thing relating to sniping that unless your game's all about sniping, you cannot do. Um, so it is problematic in the kind of the rhythm interruption that it represents from a conventional first person shooter play experience. But for their particular brand, it's at least tolerable, right? And that it's kind of it's a more difficult analysis to identify whether having it or not having it would be better. Just because they get a lot of cachet and sniperiness out of the product by having that in there. Actually, it's funny. I'm bringing up Medal of Honor 2010 again. One of the things that we were trying to depict, or at least inspired by, was in that time frame, the longest sniper kill in history was recorded. Something I can't quite remember. It was like a mile or something really really ridiculous and really far. And so we had an entire level focused on sniping across a valley, and it worked out fine for that one level. And we had a bunch of custom stuff for that one level. If we cast those rules across the rest of the game, it would have literally ruined the whole game. And so, it's I don't know if that answers what you were trying to get at, but I mean, I think it is one size does not fit all.
Yeah. And as you were talking about taking like the player's hands or taking the player away from the experience, one final tangent slash rant that always bugs me when they do it in games is like during like a platformer or an action adventure game. Like every time you pull a switch or you hit a button, the game takes control away from the player to slowly move the camera to where that door is or where whatever opened, and you can't skip that. Like, it drives me crazy sometimes if I'm playing like a platformer. Like every 20 seconds, I gotta wait to figure out that I have to go to that spot that I already knew about 30 minutes ago.
Yeah, and I mean, it really depends. I know that there's a lot of effort. I mean, our whole industry started a little late in this idea of trying to guide player actions. And so I still think you see a lot of efforts that are maybe a little bit on the coarse side. When it's done right, it feels good, and sometimes the story needs it. But when the developer is unsuccessful at conveying the importance of this moment to the audience, it's a failure of storytelling ultimately. And it's tricky because it's hard to do right, but that's not an excuse when it doesn't turn out well. If you find yourself constantly being interrupted and you're enjoying a particular flow, and the game doesn't ever allow for you to have a satisfying stretch of time to kind of play with all those mechanics, that's a huge oversight in terms of analyzing the good of what you've created for others.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I think with that, are there any aspects about feel with action-based games that you want to discuss? If not, we'll move on to turn-based or abstracted games next.
I think maybe just in terms of reinforcing the most important message is that when it comes to action, impact is super important. And I think that sometimes people don't recognize how powerful or important that impact, that feeling of impact is. And I think I wish more games cared more about it, because it would, I mean, it obviously costs money and time and people to do it.
Sorry about my headset went out for a second.
No worries, no worries. That was just my one sentence rant about the fact that too many games don't have a good enough impact in the feel of their basic interactions.
Mm-hmm. Once I want to unplug my headset and plug it back in, see that kind of shakes out the gremlins. See if that did anything there, but who knows? All right. But with that, let's turn to the harder part of our talk. And I think it was like the last five. If you want to do that again, Tomo.
What was I saying there? Okay, well, basically what I was talking about is that I have a frustration about our industry in that too often some of the basic rules of impact are either they're neglected, and that I feel like one of the easiest ways to improve quality of our products across the board is to care more about impact at a tactical level in the way you express things. Getting just knowing the basics of how to create a snap in an experience and bringing people's attention to what happens, whether it be in an action game or not, ultimately, because we're going to talk about the non-action games in just a minute,
Hmm.
is something that bothers me greatly. And it's even gotten me to a point where I imagine that there's some percentage of people that have impact blindness somehow. That it's not just that they don't agree or they don't see the need to do it, it's that they can't see it, so they don't know that they should add it.
Okay. So with that, let's get to the second half of our talk, and this is where it gets very hard in terms of game feel, because we're talking about abstracted or non-action heavy games in terms of making them feel right in the player's hands. So these are games where you're not controlling a warrior or a soldier or the Doom Marine. You are cooking food. You are bouncing a spreadsheet. You are, I don't know, you are losing. You are growing crops in a field. This is when you're not getting that same sense of, high octane, always at 11. So the question is, how do you make that feel good in the player's hands? And you can't really rely on, shotgun sounds, explosions, or glory kills to do that.
Well, I mean, as a starting point, I'd say go exactly with those to start out with and start learning how to add those flavors to your turn-based interface button clicking experience. Inevitably, you click a button and something's supposed to happen. What is it? How important is it? How much impact should it have? I mean, you don't have to stick a huge shotgun sound to the button click, but even at the very basic level of clicking a button, you still see some software approaches that in a softer fashion, where a button click you go, and that might be okay, but unless there's no reason not to, the important button should just, everything is like a snapping finger, uh, a rim shot on a drum, smacking a spatula onto a flat counter. Those things just instantly get our attention. And now, if you did that for every button press, perhaps people might get a little tired of it, right? They're just like, oh my God, stop smacking your hand on the counter. I've been doing everything I click. I just did 700 hard slaps on a counter, and I'm not enjoying this anymore. It's starting to become like acidic and frustrating. And I think that part of that is why we don't see as much game feel in action in the kind of interface style games, because there is generally a greater need for tranquility and
Mm-hmm.
smoothness in those experiences. But all that tranquility and smoothness in the experience does not mean not having explosions. It's all the same language, right? It,
Mm-hmm.
it, it just means where you put them and how much follow through sound. Like if you think of a normal, like let's take a sword swing. Sword swing has all kinds of parts to it that are
Ooh.
and not at all like impact, and actually kind of feel better when they're like milky, silky.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the milky and silky part of it makes the kind of zing or shred that happens at the business end of the sword swing all the better. So now you just imagine we're going to make a tranquil experience, and so we're going to we'll flip the script on that statement. We go mostly silky, mostly smooth, and we're using some zing or some crackle and pop to kind of make that zing better. And I mean, I think that's at least
Ooh.
will
I
be
think you are
looking
cutting up there a little bit, Tomo. Uh oh. Tomo's frozen. Well, this is not my fault, people. Oh, are you still there? Uh oh.
so I didn't catch a lot of that. I don't know how much of my monologue got cut to ribbons there.
Yeah, the last thing we were talking about making it feel like a silky or making it feel smooth, and then you just froze.
Was I talking about the silky and smooth feeling in the slower
Yeah.
turn-based? Okay, that's good. So very little was lost. It's really just flipping the script, right? In a sword swing, you're going to use some of that silky and smooth to make the zing and the slice better. And I think in the context of like a turn-based experience or just your general UI type of game experience, that you're going to use a little bit of crackle and pop to kind of make the smooth and the silky feel better. Because right, your dynamic range of results, you need, you know, you need a little bit of. You don't know how smooth a thing is until I show you how choppy it can be in some
Mm-hmm.
regards, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like your experience is going to have no drama. Something important is going to happen, and when that important thing happens, there is no disadvantage to coming on hard. Like, you know, blood curdling scream because someone walked into a room and found someone murdered. There's no action whatsoever. All we're doing is conveying emotion. In fact, all we're doing to the player at that point is saying somebody else is having emotion. But
Mm-hmm.
of course, how hard and fast that comes on, how violently that appears, makes it have more impact. It's the same then as bringing a two-handed hammer down on a skeleton's skull and smashing it into bits.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same type of event. And then it's just in a game like that, or in a turn-based or a slower experience, those events are much less frequent.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually an argument to say to make those events even more crazy, even more intense for their contrast and for their momentary drama. Of course, some of those, all the rules still apply. You can't just jump a person into just total chaos. There might be a need for a little bit of ramp up. Very much in the same vein as you can hear music change when you're watching a television show and something bad is about to happen. So we kind of emotionally get them ready so we can slap them in the face and say this is face slap time.
Yeah.
And then we go back to I don't know, the detective coming in and consoling whoever's found the dead body and saying interesting and clever things, and how chill and maybe like a pipe smoking detective, that part of the experience should be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we talk about that kind of giving the player the impact, when we talk about these kinds of games, like it brings up, I think, one of the issues we see from these games when they go so over the top, like they go for almost like a sensory overload in terms of feel. As you said earlier, like every button makes like the same, I don't know, like a fire, no, like one of like those air raid siren sounds. Every button you hit. Yeah. And like for those of you who remember, we played Grey Goo. This is a real-time strategy game from last decade, and every time. There we
Lost
go.
me again.
Yeah, there we go. Oh man, yeah, headset is getting worse. I may just have to buy like a cheap one while I wait for the microphone, use it as a backup.
Because it happens to me too, I don't think it is headset. I think there's just some internet badness that's happening around this our our streaming relationship, sort of.
Now, I think that was definitely my headset just like crapped out there, but we'll see. But the point from Grey Goo was like every time you build a unit, they use the same scenario. Unit has been completed. But the problem is that it's set to do it every time a unit is built, even if you have bulk units. So all of a sudden we just got like a good solid 60 seconds of this unit is completed. This unit is completed. This unit is completed
Oh,
over and over.
does it queue them up also so they can't overstack each other?
Yeah, I don't think they. Oh, thankfully they did that, so it's not like 47. This unit is completed, or it's all at the same time. But we played the strategy game. Shark remembers this, where in terms of like the sound being weird, like every time you click on a unit, it sounds like a dolphin making a noise. Like that's what it sounded like every time I click on a tower, or like whatever that noise was.
It's hilarious. Well, I mean, and RTSs get weird because I have a feeling sometimes they don't get tested with the kind of scale that the games can reach in
Hmm.
mind. So you can get like something like, yes, 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 sir, 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 sir.
Oh yes, and when there is this kind of issue, or when you're trying to get the feel right, I think another challenge is that it's very easy to overwhelm a player, especially a new player, in terms of what they should be focusing on. When we talk about like turn based or strategy titles where you have a UI that takes up the entire screen. There's buttons and icons and things flashing all over the place. And as a new player, you don't know what any of this stuff means, and it's very hard to to get that to feel right when the player has no frame of reference to begin with.
Yeah, and I think that's why you see some of the veteran developers out there that have a history of making kind of turn-based long haul session games,
Mm-hmm.
that they create an experience that is very placid, right? They very rarely break from the most tranquil of environments, um, and that they're loath to do it. I mean, over at Hyperkinetic, we lean a little bit more on the action games because we played a lot more of them and made more of them, and so we're trying to apply some of those processes to Epic Tavern, which is ultimately a storytelling game that's been deconstructed into a number of choices that the player can make. It could easily be a completely tranquil experience. It's just that we just realized that variety is good for everyone, and if you get the pacing right, pacing in stories, the best stories aren't calm the whole way through, and they certainly aren't crazy the whole way through. Everything there are patterns and rhythms of ups and downs that just work better for people than other patterns, and very few of those patterns have none of the awesome crazy, and for sure very few of them have nothing but the awesome crazy.
Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting about that in terms of trying to keep that experience very subtle, very muted. I was thinking about, we were talking about this on the Discord about Anno. And Anno is a franchise I think has grown a lot. And thank you for bringing up Xcom and Phoenix Down, because I wanted to talk about them as well in terms of that kind of feedback, because they did like the complete opposite of what we're talking about right now. But one of the things that Anno did, especially with 1800,
Yeah.
was add a lot more personality to the cities. And this is like a complete 180 from 2205, where you can have 900 rows of the same, worker building, and there's no change, there's no overlap. It's just the same thing. It's just like a monolithic city. And then you go to 1800, you can see like people walking around. You can actually track, if your city looks beautiful, they'll have higher quality buildings. One of the things that just took me for a surprise is that you can now have festivals in your city. Like all of a sudden we had beer fest, and like I'm trying to build something. I see like a marching band moving through downtown of my city, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about in the first part, with that sense that the player is impacting the game, and the game is responding to that.
Yeah, I think, I'm going to answer this question. I'm actually not going to be able to make it another half an hour if I don't go pee. But
Okay.
I think it's really important that, like, so much of our early, especially PC games, were very clinical.
Mm-hmm.
And that the kind of experience of enjoying the little things has taken a long time to get introduced. And when it's done well, it really transforms the experience. It makes it much more emotional and much more joyful. And I'm going to be right back. Apologies.
That's all right. Remember, folks, always have enough drinks and bathroom breaks planned before you start these streams. But while Tomo is taking care of that, we'll talk about Phoenix Point and XCOM when he gets back. But it reminds me, like as he said, like the city builder genre in particular, I think has been a really good example of this. That sense of trying to instill a personality to these cities. I remember something when I spoke with Chris Beatrice. No, yeah, that was his name. Who was the head of the Impressions era? He did, Caesar, Pharaoh, all those games. And one of the things that we talked about in terms of why people play city builders is, I think it's that same allure of people who build model train sets that, or model trains. That it's not just you building the setup, it's you watching all these things that you set up work. And it works, in, this, everything is working perfectly. Everything's in alignment. The people are going to the right spot. The train is not, running into a car or anything like that. And city builders took a long time to, I think, really show that off. City skylines, in particular, I think was a really good example. That it's not just you placing your buildings down, you're building your roads, and that's it. You can actually watch the traffic flow of your of how, like, the people move around your city. And it was such, I think, a big change in instilling this sense of a personality to the game. And for you, Tomo, as you could just got back, I was talking about city skylines and how the city builder genre really try to add more personality to these buildings and just to the overall structure than they were like 20, 25 years ago.
And I mean, I think the word feel is the right word to use. Like, the games care more about how you feel. They're trying to make you feel certain ways. And I think if you go back far enough, they weren't trying to make you feel a certain way except through the specific mechanics in the game that were all heading towards overall success and failure criteria. And that took a while. It felt like Ogre from Revenge of the Nerds. I guess I've been drinking a lot more coffee these days. That's the big change, I guess, for me in this global crisis.
Yep, and trying to make that feel like in a turn-based or an abstracted game, like as we said, like at the start of our little talk, it's about kind of the aesthetics, the mood of the game that it's very hard, I think, for developers to think about. And like, I'm going to throw this over to you with Epic Tavern. Like, how are you and the rest of your team, I guess, working on like the feel? Because again, Epic Tavern is not a high stakes action game. It is a game that's very much about making choices, clicking on menus, rolling dice. So how does that feel good to you?
So, I mean, those specific choices, it is fairly difficult. I mean, at the very least, you start at the context of clarity. Why are you making this choice? What should you expect to happen as a result of this choice? And when it happens, making it clear what it is. But in, our choice of having a 3D bar scene for half of the phases of the turn, we get to see characters sitting at tables and acting like people at a bar, enjoying their drinks, making cheers-like gestures. Those are all things that kind of fill in the feeling of being in a bar, and the feeling of being in a bar is important. So we'll deploy some, or for the longest time, we were deploying some percentage of our resources towards continuing that process and making it feel better. I think we could do a lot better than we've done so far still. But that's at least one way of thinking about the development resources that you're associating with feeling. What are the things that you're doing that are purely cosmetic because they're intended to create a particular feeling? Then there's also feature designs that are trying to promote certain feelings. And then probably the easiest stuff is just how do you dress up an interaction or a result so that it has more feeling or has more impact. And that's some of the most straightforward stuff and some of the stuff that we've been probably most successful at. There's a moment in the game where you run into an encounter. There's a block of text that describes what that encounter is about. You have up to 4 characters in your party, and each of those characters get to choose what action they're going to use to try to overcome the challenge of that encounter. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, depending on how well the die roll turns out, you'll get progressively larger visual effect results indicating your success or excellent result or heroic results or failures or disastrous results, and they all have a character to their visual as well as some audio.
Yeah, Ben, and what you were just describing with having the 3D scene of the tavern, I think that's another thing that first-time or starting-out developers tend to slip up on, is that I've played these games that every screen is just literally a static image. There is no sense of motion. Clicking a button just simply, not even like a transition. It just immediately goes to another screen. Like as you were saying a few minutes ago, it feels very clinical. It feels very sterile in the player's hands.
And I think that's why those kinds of games have historically had a relatively small audience.
Mm-hmm.
To be fair, those games, when they're done right, that small audience is very fanatical, and I really definitely count myself as one of those users. But when those games then add more to it, because one of the benefits of a very system-heavy, super long total hours played
Mm-hmm.
game is that it becomes a very personal story experience for the
Mm-hmm.
player because they make all these choices, and everything that's happening after a while, it's the byproduct of the choices that you made, so you have more stake in it. I think giving me positive or negative feedback on when things happen, I'm more inclined to feel it even more intensely after playing a game like Football Manager for over 100 hours. Like, I really care what happens to those people. In fact, I not only did I recruit this character, I recruited the character that's been training this character, and that person had a dramatic end to their career because of an injury or something, and that was a big hurdle to overcome. And now this character is gaining a benefit from working with, I mean, that story goes on and on, and if you give me the right kind of cues and interesting visual and audio effects to go along with important events, I feel it and I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And so when you get that right, I think somewhere in amongst all this development that's happening in games, especially long haul PC games these days, is that it's getting to this, to really kind of, I don't know what's the right word, like concentrating or distilling the long term spreadsheet experience into an emotional storytelling experience.
And one of the things I was thinking about is the idle genre. That the idle genre is the quintessential, just systems heavy game. It very much like there's no aesthetics to some of the more addictive clicker games. Like that paperclip one, or even something simple like a cookie clicker. But
uh, Cookie Clicker has some graphics at
yeah,
least.
lots of cookies and milk. And the example I want to think about is Clicker Heroes 2. I don't know if you had a chance to play that one yet. That is
Okay.
their attempt at actually making a retail price clicker idle game. And one of the things that they're trying to do is really go all in on the production values. It's not just a static character. You can actually see your character running on the field. And one of my favorite points is that when you get to a time section that you have to kill the enemies in a specific amount of time, the music changes and it's like this operatic, like almost like a JRPG, boss theme going on
Nice.
as you're having to rush through and kill all these enemies. And it's very interesting about how they're trying to give a sense of feel to a genre that, again, it just started with you just literally clicking a button 10 million times over and over again.
Totally. Well, I mean, to be fair, nowadays you click much less.
Yeah.
you and it's weird. It's weird that clicking much less and watching a lot more has somehow become a significant improvement to a genre.
Mm-hmm.
These aren't words that I think we were expecting to hear, 20 years ago. Although it's about 20 years ago for Cookie Clicker, right?
Let's
Maybe,
see.
maybe like 16, 17 years, something like that. Yeah, I think it's in the clicker genre that some of these techniques have the most potential benefit, right? It's that I
Mm-hmm.
don't do anything. If I do stuff. I like these kinds of games, actually. I put a bunch of time into them. I research all of the ones that I can find. Do you know of the game Wizard and Minion?
What was that? You kind of clicked off there for a second.
Oh, do you know the game Wizard and Minion Idol?
No.
Oh, it's one of these idle games. But what was interesting about it is that the gameplay of it transforms from month to month, and it's a many, many, many month
Hmm.
experience. It's not a pretty experience. Maybe it's not even entirely a well focused from one step to the next step experience, but it does evolve over time. And it's the kind of game that can benefit greatly. Well, maybe not Wizard Minion Idol specifically. In fact, I think Clicker Heroes 2 is a good example of using kind of like cool visuals and exciting or exhilarating visuals to kind of add to the drama of really what amounts to accumulating bigger numbers faster.
Mm-hmm. And according to Google, Cookie Clicker came out in 2013. I thought it was older than that.
Oh, 2013. Okay. Cookie Clicker 2013, huh? Um, and and when is Cow Clicker? When is the
Let's see.
Clicker? 2010.
Okay.
So what came before that? I mean, because Cow Clicker, right? Of course, Cow Clicker is a commentary.
Mm-hmm.
So something had to come before it, right? What is the earliest
Now I don't know.
idle game? According to Pecorello, first emerged in 2002 with Progress Quest in 2002 was the
Okay.
game. There's a Gamma Sutra article called "The Rise of Games You parentheses mostly don't play."
Yeah, and like to Mr. Elwood's point about One Finger Death Punch, I think it was. That was another really good example of like that kind of feel. Again, you're just clicking left and right, but every time you do it, your character does some kind of crazy over the top attack and animation, and it just adds to that. Um, Now, here's a question. Before we get to XCOM, I want to throw this to you. What do you think about feel when we talk about the grand strategy genre? When we're talking about, Civilization, Europa Universalis, Dolores, like, do you think there's been movement in terms of feel in those respective areas?
I mean, I gotta say, yeah. I mean, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, I feel like the Paradox Interactive model of games has kind of dramatized itself in a much better fashion. I mean, Stellaris, I feel like, was a great move towards turning a grand strategy game into the fantasy of mankind reaching out into space, maybe for the first time ever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I feel like the storytelling capabilities of developers in that space is growing. To be fair, I think that there's a lot of good reason for that. I think that those games have in on Steam, they've found a user base that has allowed them to have lots of comfort and stability, right? I don't know, the 1.5 million of us that are Paradox Interactive fanatics regularly buy their games, and that I think that's gotten them to being one of the top 3 Steam PC publishers, actually. Maybe not the top. I'm not sure
Mm-hmm.
exactly about the stats, but they're doing real good, and that stability gives them room now to add and grow their products.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Mr. Overreed's talking about Hearts of Iron is really nice, but still an Excel game, and boy, is
Yes.
Hearts of Iron a complicated game.
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
these games aren't even the kind of games that you can just pick up and play. You start playing them, and then you're basically buying into taking a class. And
Mm-hmm.
it might take you more than one class to get to the part where you're okay at understanding the game. That's not the model that North American console games followed ever, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And I love them. I love those games. Crusader Kings 2, Hearts of Iron. I mean, I put tons, hundreds and hundreds of hours into those games.
Yeah, and I know Thorn was talking about Total War earlier in the Discord, and Total War I think is another example of that kind of evolution in terms of feel. Because the big thing about Total War at the beginning was this idea of we're not only going to let you manage your provinces and your base building, we're going to let you watch 1,000 on 1,000 armies just smash into each other and just see it all blow up like that.
Yeah, I mean, at first, Total War was just honestly, I feel like it was just clever, really smart people combining two good genres,
Mm-hmm.
and frankly, probably only doing okay at either, but that peanut butter and chocolate are better together. It turns out, and but they've been at it for a hell of a long time, and what we're left with at this point is insanely cultivated and refined game type, right? That nobody else does.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are a couple out there. There's like the King
Mm,
Arthur
yeah.
game series is kind of similar, I think. But no one does it as smooth and as tight as Creative Assembly. And to be
Hmm.
fair, Creative Assembly is, one of a kind company, I guess, in many ways.
Hmm.
Hell, they probably held the door to PC development open during the Dark Ages, among a handful of other developers.
Hmm. Yeah, but again, with what we're talking about Solaris and chat there, like they Paradox are like the masters at DLC and post-release support for their games now.
Have you ever looked at the list of Crusader Kings
Oh God,
DLCs?
yes. Oh yes. And like I think one of the very interesting things about Total War, I want to get like everybody's thoughts on this. That in terms of like these turn-based and more abstracted designs, it seems like one of the ways a lot of developers have been trying to add that sense of feel has been trying to give more personality to the units or to the characters themselves. And what I mean by that is, if you look at something like I'm going really reaching with this one, look at Advance Wars versus Fire Emblem as an example. Both are turn-based strategy games. One, you control nondescript tanks, you control, nondescript soldiers. The other, you control, these characters, the unique personalities. They have their own dialogue, they have their own story to it. And the same thing with Total War. That in the original Total War games, like we're going way back to like the original Medieval and Shogun, it's just, you have an army of 10,000 nondescript cavalry. That's it. You look at Three Kingdoms, you have, the entire romance of the Three Kingdoms characters, leading armies and being
Yeah.
your rulers and etc.
I mean, honestly, it's a simple feature, but it's overwhelmingly effective.
Mm-hmm.
Is the simple idea that we're going to add a hero to this unit and it's going to make the unit better, and that hero has a personality and that hero can gain attributes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you just think just your analogy there between Advance Wars and Fire Emblem, and seriously, it is a game. It is a description of a type of game I hope to make someday. And I kind of have some confidence that people aren't going to try to make it just because turn-based strategy doesn't get a lot of dev action. But if you had an Advance Wars game where you could attach heroes that gained experience and conferred abilities to your Advance Wars units, it'd be twice as good, provided all other things were equal. And I'm not saying that making a copy of Advance Wars is trivial by any means, although Little Big War Game did a very good job of it, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think speaking about like turn-based and tactical strategy games, I think that's a perfect segue into talking about XCOM and how XCOM
Hmm.
has done a lot in terms of making the game feel in various aspects for the player. And XCOM has come a long way, and by extension, of course, Phoenix Point, as we mentioned earlier. And I think they could very well be like one of the originators for that idea of giving the player units that they care about. That's not just, you're building the 30th Tiger tank. No, you're building a character you can name, you customize their hair, at least in the original, and then you watch that character get sniped by a sectoid, from behind that dark corner you didn't see.
And that's the thing is, right? In Advance Wars, when you lose a unit, you kind of feel it because it's not
Mm-hmm.
it's not optimal. In
Yeah.
XCOM, you lose a character and you're like, that's it. I'm either done with this game or I'm reloading.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the same thing for a Fire Emblem. That you lose that character, their story is gone. And many people have done straight Iron Man modes of Fire Emblem or Iron Man plays just so they didn't want to lose a unit. And, have that character have their death on their hands.
Well, it's partly why I like some of these games that are coming out where when characters die, they just become disabled for a period of time,
Mm-hmm.
and that is really one of the basic features of the game is that they're not dead,
Mm-hmm.
and that you just have to pay a price. I think what I like about that is any feature in a game that gets you to reload a save. I think if it happens too frequently is problematic because basically the game is telling you that you should erase your mistakes.
Hmm.
And that you get a much more dramatic experience if you overcome your mistakes. And that's a tricky thing to try to push onto the player, because players like, well, why not do it more? Why not do it better?
Hmm.
Why not be more optimal? Why not spend less resources? Why not have the ability to spend more XP where it matters and be able to do things better? And it's min-maxing is what it is. We know how exciting it can be. I mean, to whatever extent this conversation is deviated from some of the the starting positions of the stream, I think it's really interesting stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah. And to Dino's point about design trees having 10,000 units makes it very tough to make the player care about them. I think there's two senses of feel when we talk about these kinds of strategy games. There's the personality or the personalization. Having a character that you built, you designed their clothing, you gave them a unique look to them, and then I think there's kind of like the raw value. Like, did this character have? Is this a level 15 character? Does this character have the +7 sword? And it's kind of, I guess, do you think they're both equal, or do you think they're different in terms of like how a player approaches that sense of caring about something like that?
In terms of their level gain versus their equipment.
Like almost like the stat or the mechanical growth versus like the personal growth.
Yeah, personal growth is tricky, right? Anything that isn't actually a part of the rules
Yeah.
is runs the risk of being ignored by the player, right? Because it won't be consequential. Um, and then at the same time, having rules in your game that care about, maybe that care about a philosophical change in a character is a little unorthodox,
Hmm.
and it's not even clear how you make that work necessarily. And we've been exploring a lot of this stuff in Epic Tavern, and it's real complicated. And
Hmm.
you know, I mean, I don't have conclusions yet. I'm still in the middle of researching that through action in many ways. So I think that the stats do matter to players more
Hmm.
than the other things, unless you can make the other things matter.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, we've seen in many cases, if someone's going to be putting hundreds of hours into the game and they're going to keep playing it for the long haul, there's much room to offer customization to that player, and that'll keep them interested for longer because they can make it match their vision better.
Yeah.
Um, and that is, I guess, that is definitely a part of the feel, in terms of that we've created features that allow you to paint the game to your liking, in at least in some of its aspects. And now, as a result, you like the experience more. Just knowing that I can make a change to, um, you know, I don't know, the chair I'm sitting on to make it a more better chair sitting experience is something. And that it can, even if I never change the chair, to know that I could change it for the better helps me like sitting on it more to some extent.
Yeah. And I think you always run that risk of, if you make the personalization options a part of the gameplay, in a weird way, I think it can also be seen as kind of a punishment for the players who don't do that. If I make my character look beautiful enough, they lose +7 accuracy when they're attacking enemies. Because, like you said, there are people like, I am not that big on personalization, as the chat is well, accustomed to. Like when I make a character in a Dark Souls game, it's, does that character have brown hair? Yes. We're done. That's the extent of my personal modeling for a character. But then you have somebody who will completely model the curvature of their face to try and make that character look as accurately as possible to them when they're playing a Dark Souls game.
Totally. Well, some examples of where the character's personality can start mattering would be, uh, you know, if the character is an aggressive person, and so they have access to like an aggressive style of attack, and that if only they could go through a come to Jesus moment and I could rid myself of that aggressive personality trait, and in doing so gain access to like a cautious attack type of some sort, and that a cautious attack type has a utility to it that I'd love to be using more frequently. It allow
Mm-hmm.
me to optimize, allow me to reduce like the incidence of characters dying or something. Then it's starting to now to matter a ton, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you're kind of like, how do I cook this story up so that I can get this character to the right type of personality? And now that's largely, it's pretty uncommon, right? You don't have a lot of those kinds of thoughts in games. Um, that doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. I feel confident that there are a lot of developers that would love to do that, and they think about it at least sometimes. They just need the right examples.
Hmm.
They need the first. They need the new cut. They need the first the people to break through the ice on that. Get some games out there with some interesting features to inspire the rest of us.
Hmm. Yeah. And like going back to XCOM, one of the things that they did with XCOM 2, and especially with the expansion, was try and tie these personalization or these aesthetic options to the gameplay itself, like how characters' personalities will develop, how friendships will form, even like the propaganda radio that will change based on how you do missions. All like we've said, like all these little details that add, I think, personality to this world seems to be the important factor when we talk about feel in an abstracted setting.
Absolutely. And I mean, I feel like, we talked about Valkyria Chronicles in the last
Mm-hmm.
stream and some of the character relationship features that it supports that maybe didn't pan out perfectly, right? Because it didn't
Mm-hmm.
create a feeling of character relationships that you could be working off of to create better or worse results. Um, and that maybe tuning a feature set like that can end up getting, well, for sure, it could probably end up getting better results. Ones that you're considering more frequently, and ones that aren't as hard to solve for. Um, at the very least, getting in these features where characters, when they are together, they work better, and
Mm-hmm.
that there aren't many disadvantages in the flow of things. Um, I know in the context of Epic Tavern, we're exploring an idea where characters that spend any amount of time with each other start to grow an affinity for each other, and then sending them out together is likely, or they'll perform better if they go out together. But at the same time, if terribly bad results occur when they're together, then that might reduce their liking of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just trying to play with those kinds of features until you get results that make sense, until you get an experience that a player can read as, oh, those characters get along better, that's why they do better. And now I'm thinking about it. Now it's an active part of my decision making storytelling because
Mm-hmm.
I'm considering that factor when I'm actually playing the game. And in terms of the feel, now there is fundamentally more emotion in my managing of my party members. And so it's like
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the steps I think these turn-based games need to take to get more resonance in there. I mean, in an action game, most of the emotion is just adrenaline, right? And
Mm-hmm.
keeping up, and or the feeling of kicking ass. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have much time for too much more nuance than that. But in that turn-based setting, you have all kinds of space to pack all kinds of other feelings.
Yeah. Or like with Anno, and like how you can, as you're mousing over your city, you can hear people talking below it. You can like watch, the little winemaker, push the barrel up the hill to take it to the press. And again, that has no gameplay implications. Watching this little animation is not helping you play the game, but it's adding to that sense again that you know there's a world to this. It's not just static characters. And we've been talking about XCOM, and to Mr. Elwood's point, we're talking about XCOM 1 or 2. I have not played Chimera Squad. I will probably be getting it day one just because I love XCOM, so we'll be playing it then. But XCOM, for the longest time, as any fan of XCOM knows, people have been doing after action reports or writing stories about their characters since the original XCOM. I have read some amazing things of people who have novelized these XCOM encounters. And it feels like maybe like the next step for these kinds of games is to really look into how do they take, these stories and actually have them be conveyed in game. That, like you said, like with like having like two characters who are friendly with each other, teaming up for an attack, like being able to convey that in not just the game mechanics, but actually have that be a part of the aesthetics or theme, could be a really big push.
Yeah, no, and I think that anytime you depict any change at all that is based on those kinds of facets of the experience,
Mm-hmm.
you increase your chances that players think about them.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously if there is no change as a result of the personality of a given character, then there's no way for a player to kind of see that.
Yeah.
Like you're like, but it says in their character sheet, and it's like it turns out people don't look at that part of the character sheet, so they never know. Right? Every change that it causes though is one unit of evidence for you to be thinking about it. There are a lot of changes that are below our radar that we can't make enough sense of or we don't consider important enough to change the way we think about things. And so, in many cases, you have to dial up something to be pretty loud on the volume scale for someone to take notice of, especially in a complicated game where there are a lot of things to be managing. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, nothing is better than having it work as part of the mechanics. Like the moment I get a benefit for having characters that like to work together, be together,
Mm-hmm.
now I'm thinking about it, especially if the game's hard enough that I could benefit from that power boost. So that's
Mm-hmm.
step one. I mean, and you don't have to have that be a part of the game. Um, Although the question I would ask is why are you averse to it? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's an interesting thing to depict, especially in the context of like constructing parties. The logic of putting a party together should be considerate of all the things that run the risk of reducing their effectiveness and has the possibility of improving their effectiveness.
Yeah.
And the more those things that make sense to a player that actually improve or hurt the party's performance, the better. Because the more a player can consider, the more a player imagines this rich and nuanced thing that is these characters that are going to be working together to overcome some obstacle.
Yeah.
Oh, Dini talks about morale. Morale is huge, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it describes characters. Morale is a part of everybody. And
Yeah.
so if you depict it well or, not in a way that's too frustrating, it can become a huge asset to the way I remember and experience the game.
Yeah. And and to Mr. Elwood's point about story and strategy games, yep, that would be another example of trying to convey more to the player as to what's going on. Again, this idea that you're not just controlling, random tanks or individual or randomized soldiers. In Command and Conquer, you are fighting Kane, the Brotherhood of Nod, or everybody's favorite from Red Alert, was it 3, when Tim Curry does his quote unquote best Russian accent and is like yelling at you to do stuff.
Well, I mean, that, EA's efforts in those particular
Mm-hmm.
RTSs is pretty legendary and pretty unique, right? You don't have a lot of other games out there that made the effort to get the actors and to shoot the scenes to deliver so much kind of comedy and nerdcore gratification in acting. I think it was really effective, and I think that's kind of what sets Command and Conquer apart in so many ways from all the
Mm-hmm.
other RTSs. I mean, I'm just gonna leave it at that.
All right. I think there's one last part I want to talk about with the with like the turn-based side, and I think that's going to do it for me. And if there's anything else that comes up for you, definitely feel free to say it. But one thing, speaking about XCOM and Phoenix Point, and again, this trying to add more personality. I want to get everybody's thoughts on this, on the whole action shots that they've been implementing since XCOM Enemy Unknown. That there are cases where when you're shooting an enemy, it's not just you point the gun, the guy shoots, the guy dies. You get this whole cinematic camera angle of watching the character line up the shot. You shoot it, the enemy dies in slow motion, and I think this kind of runs into that issue of a diminishing return. So the first time it happened, it's wow, great. But when you're up to the 10th time watching your sniper slowly aim, and it's going to hit because that's the only time the cinematic camera happens, it kind of feels like a wasted effort. I think at that point.
Well, I mean, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. Certainly, you're going to get so much repetition of that, so much repetition on that event that the term of engagement on the game that many of us are going to have is too long for that much repetition. There's too much of it's going to happen, and we're going to get exhausted by it. But that has to be balanced out against the positive impact it has at the beginning of the experience. At the beginning of the experience, it starts to kind of seals our interest in the game, right? By kind of
Mhm.
dramatizing some of these important, theoretically rare events, which are ultimately aren't that rare. Um, I think it's the right call, but I do think it could be improved if there were ways to kind of shrink its footprint over the course long haul, over the
Mhm.
course of time. After I've been playing for 20 hours, maybe skip every other one. Maybe after I've been playing for 100 hours, skip 3 out of 4 of them or something. And or keep squeezing into a smaller space how much I need to succeed by to get that to happen, right? Because now I've acclimated to a regular critical hit. I don't care. I'm gonna get I'm
Mhm.
gonna get I'm gonna get 10,000 more critical hits in this game before I'm done playing. So now a level 2 critical hit, or just a critical hit plus a small long odds chance of getting a uh, I don't know, something crazy like if I could shoot through one person, hit someone else. Now that's the only thing that shows it. Any of those approaches would be considering the hardcore player's perspective. To be fair, it's the other thing you can do with us hardcore players. Once you have us, you can do things that bother us and we stick
Yeah,
around still.
of course. You only hurt the ones you love, right? Well, I think that is the model of XCOM right there. I think that's their MO.
You can only hurt the ones you love. Totally, totally. Well, XCOM is mildly frustrating compared to things like old school Jagged Alliance. Holy mackerel!
Oh yes.
I tried to go back to that and play over the
Mm.
years, and mostly have been unsuccessful and not even getting through the first encounter.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, this is harder than I remember. Not going to play for a while. It's like, oh, that sucks. Not going to play for a while.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of interesting. Like one of the things I think this trend that we saw in oh yeah, you never do, Shark. I know. But one of this trend that we've seen from turn-based or more abstracted designs for the last decade was this greater sense of adding personality to it. That, like you said, like for somebody who's a hardcore XCOM fan, they know these mechanics and systems so hard. Like you're not going to do anything in that front that's going to, wildly change your expectations. But there seems to be more room these days, maybe just with the growth of game engines, to be able to add more of this sense of personality to these games.
Yeah, no, and I think there's that. I like to blame the period of time in indie games where we got way more focused on story and we were
Mm-hmm.
exploring alternate types of games. And many of them had to be very fixated on the experiential over the mechanical.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of just like that broke up the deadlock of mechanics and skill challenge as the only way to make games. And it's had positive effects on all fronts. One, we can have a game that's purely experiential, which is fine, especially when it's done well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then all those games that were all tightened up, maybe too tight and locked up into being these kind of clinical expressions of skill, have loosened up their attitude a bit, and they care about sweetening the experience. And when they do it well, it's awesome. I mean, in some ways, you could say like a fight scene or a gunfight in a movie is the analogy for an action game.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've seen the same thing in those action scenes. They got real good from a technical standpoint. They started getting a little more realistic, and they started caring more about the mechanics of the fight. And then in more recent times, they've taken that good mechanical model and then they sweeten the deal. I'm sure Hong Kong had an effect on that to some extent as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Or watching The Raid as well.
Raid is a good example for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Although, um, it's I think the trajectory of Wo Ping is the guy to keep. He's the trajectory of development in that whole wire
Mm-hmm.
editing extravaganza for fight scenes. Shoot, it is the Wong Kar Wai movie Grandmaster. a very, very different take on like Ip Man, perhaps. But if you haven't seen that movie, it's got some of the most nuanced and coolest like tactical accelerating and decelerating of filming speeds and cuts between hands and faces in fights that I've seen.
Yeah. And talking about this idea of the experience, it reminds me when we just had that discussion with Jack and Edmar the other day, where we talked about how much that experience, I think, is a major part of game design these days. That I think more developers are understanding that it's not just about 100% story or 100% mechanics, but about how they all coalesce together. And again, like as we're describing this stuff, it sounds very easy to do. We talk about how XCOM has personality, but again, like this is a lot of these kinds of discussions. A lot of people don't necessarily think about, and it's very hard to understand it if you're not already looking at it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you can take a look at the entire trajectory of video game development, and
Mm-hmm.
most of it is us just trying to figure out what the hell it is.
Yeah.
And I think that we just overlooked the reality that it's still an entertainment form like any other, and what's going on for the user um, is more than intellectual, and it's more
Mm-hmm.
than a skill challenge. It includes all of the emotional resonance, and that all of those things are working together. It's just that because games feel so different because they have that skill expression as a part of it, we overlooked the other forms of entertainment that have only the emotional resonance to work with. Um, you know, back when I was new to video games, I felt a lot of people would say things like story and video games have no role to play with each other, and
Mm-hmm.
that's, I mean, frankly, at the time it was ridiculous, honestly. But in hindsight, it's just insane to
Mm-hmm.
imagine saying something like that.
Yeah.
Even something, I mean, you know, where would Angry Birds be if it didn't have a story that you could kind of guess at? And it might take you forever. Maybe you don't actually care, but it has a really big effect. And then
Mm-hmm.
fun, weird stuff like, why do the pigs carry ham in their houses? The moment you see that, you never forget.
Yeah. And it kind of adds like this kind of feel. I think this will be like my final point, that it adds kind of like that X factor to a lot of games in terms of elevating them. And like I brought up in a post I just wrote, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, that
Yeah, damn.
from an action standpoint, it's not the best action game. It is nowhere. It does not have the depth or the gameplay of something like Dark Souls or Devil May Cry or any of those other games. But on the other hand, they weren't. That wasn't their goal that they were aiming for, and they really got the visceral nature of combat like hands down in that game. Like when she swings that sword and hits somebody, you can feel it with like every frame of animation as she hits an enemy and she's yelling at the same time. And
Yeah,
yep, go ahead.
no, 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 go for it. Continue.
I was going to say, and it creates something that feels. It doesn't feel like individual parts. It's that again that phrase. It's greater than the sum of its parts when it all comes together like that.
Yeah. I feel like Sinuous Sacrifice is, more of a holistic masterpiece than many of its peers.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I know games, especially games like that, like they revolve so much around their mechanics. If you're not in first place on mechanics, it's hard to be in first place. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it deserved all the awards it got.
Yeah, definitely. So I think with that, to kind of wrap up this discussion, and oh, actually, before I do that, any other aspects of talking about like abstracted games and kind of getting that feel right that we didn't bring up?
Well, maybe just to kind of a recap again,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like I said with the action stuff. It's there are a number of ways that we should be thinking about the games we build, and I think it's easy to overlook how important the feeling of pushing a button can be,
Mm-hmm.
and that when it is overlooked, you're leaving quality experience on the
Mm-hmm.
table. You're choosing on accident not to make it better. That there's something about the function of that button. That button's different than other buttons. It everything about it should be different in the ways in which it is different from the other choices players make. And maybe you don't have enough time or resources to make every button the perfect expression of what it needs to be. But there is nothing different about clicking a button to make something explode
Mm-hmm.
than there is a clicking a button and it's shooting a projectile and making something explode. It's those things are the same. It's easier for us to imagine how to improve it and connect it more appropriately in an action context because it matches our imagination of reality better.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not a good excuse not to be thinking about it and doing it in the context of the games that aren't a direct one-to-one for people doing things like chopping each other's heads off or
Mm-hmm.
even giving each other hugs. There are plenty of buttons in many a game that really should be all about hugs. How do you convey the hug when you click the button?
Yeah. And I think if you want kind of a darker example of this, we can look at mobile and free to play games that they make their UIs very expressive. You know, giant buttons. You click a button, it lights up with stars and graphics. The whole loot box industry is a very big example of this, even though it's not something we particularly like to talk about. But there's a reason why those systems attract people. Because again, you can just click a button and the game pops up saying, you got a character. That's it. But you can click a button, you watch an entire spectacle of animation. And it is hokey, it is very cheesy. But again, it adds to that sense that there's more going on under the surface.
Yeah, for sure. I think that we might be making we're making a mistake in this stream if we don't bring up PopCap games. Honestly,
Mm-hmm.
I think that the PopCap story of PopCap's success, and especially at the beginning when a lot of maybe developers might have had contempt for the kinds of games they were
Yeah.
making, and certainly confusion and frustration at their degree of success. But
Mm-hmm.
it's just that they understood what they were doing. They realized, right, that all
Mm-hmm.
the way down to the button or whatever puzzly mechanics that are going on, that they should be springy, springy, impactful, explosive,
Mm-hmm.
giggly, or whatever it might be, and to 11 when necessary. They they I think set the tone for mobile interface probably more than any other company in the world.
Yeah. There's probably I think that's another good podcast topic, talking about casual design and kind of demystifying it for a lot of people because like you said, there's been a stigma that a lot of people think casual design is, the lesser. It's easy to make a casual game, but I think in reality it's very hard to do casual design right.
Yeah, there's just as much sophistication. To be fair, the people that make casual games,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they're offended that we don't think that they're as sophisticated.
Mm-hmm.
They just look at their bank accounts.
Yeah, and like the ultimate PopCap example is, when Ode to Joy plays in Peggle. Like that
Nice,
last
exactly.
ball, and I think that is a really good example of kind of like the anticipation in that event. Like the problem with XCOM, like with that, the glory kill or the zoom in kind of thing, is that it happens so regularly that it just becomes very commonplace. But with Peggle, we know what's going to happen. It's going to be the last ball, the last hit. That's when you're going to get that event. So there's that build up to it, and that the second that camera starts to pan in, that here it comes, we're going to get it, and then boom, and then the celebration happens.
So I'm going to say something that might sound like a criticism on XCOM, and I don't mean it that way. It's just total coincidence, honestly. When I was younger, we would talk about new designers versus veteran designers. And the new designers would be fixated on making an event occur, an event that they've envisioned, an event that they like. And so
Mm-hmm.
their minds are wrapped around a thing happening.
Mm-hmm.
The more veteran designers are thinking about the totality of the experience as a
Mm-hmm.
singular thing and all the things it needs and its kind of ups and downs. And it's kind of like one is conducting an orchestra and the other is standing there going like, I'm going to do that really awesome trumpet
Mm-hmm.
solo in just a couple seconds and I'm going to make sure it's perfect. Now, both are extremely important expressions of skill and talent and the creation of entertainment. but definitely there that you can't have a good orchestra without a good conductor.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's kind of like there's a tangent there that I've been thinking about with a lot of like TV shows and movies these days, and how they write, and they kind of seem to focus entirely on like those events. That it's all about getting that 3 second teaser for the commercial, rather than building like a cohesive narrative to that story.
And for commercials, that's perfect.
Yeah,
Unfortunately,
yeah, I
I'm sure
remember.
there's a I'm sure there's a pornography analogy to put in there as well,
Oh, there we go.
right?
Why are
That
these?
pornography is a little focused, a little too event focused, right, and not enough continuum focused.
Well, there's the D mod for this chat. There has to be at least one for every time we do a live stream on YouTube, I bet. But yeah, I remember like one time I was like flipping through the channels. I turned that show Gotham. That was supposed to be like the overly dramatic, prequel to Batman. And like all of a sudden the character like says something, like the camera like zooms in, like she's posing and she's saying some like badass lines. Like, what the hell was that? Like, that was made entirely just for like a promo teaser. Like, it has like no relation to the story, but like it just feels completely like weird and off-putting. But again, it was this big bombastic moment.
It reminds me just of somehow how excellently they've handled some of the performances in some of the seasons of American Horror Story.
Mm.
It's kind of like even though it is such intense horror and gore, sometimes there's a lot of really good stuff in that TV series.
Thank you, Shark. I was just thinking about that too. The most
Oh, I'm not good at
graphically
talking about that kind of stuff.
non-graphic discussion ever.
I mean,
Oh.
I, I've no I love the ideas around the way people think, and of course, gratifying ourselves and the stuff that we're most attracted to isn't always the most high-minded. And often it can be very simplistic. I think the I think there is probably a real serious talk about the range of ways in which we entertain ourselves, ranging from like
Hmm.
perhaps pornography to I don't know what's on the opposite end of pornography. Theoretical physics videos that get interesting, complicated ideas across. I'm not 100% sure, but that's probably why it'd be an interesting topic.
All right, so I think with that, I guess to kind of sum things up for people tuning in late or who just skip to the end, when we talk about good feel in a game, it really, I think, comes down to one, you're making the player feel like they have an impact, and two, that the world is alive. Like, there is a sense of personality to what's happening in the game. And there are a lot of little things that go into this. And it's something that I think, as we've said, really adds into this idea of examining the experience of a game as, a cohesive whole versus just story on one side, gameplay on the other side, and the two will never meet in the middle.
Yeah, and thankfully we've come a long way.
Yeah. But I think with that, I am just about out of things to say. My voice is slowly but surely dying. So, do you have anything to wrap things up with, Tomo?
Um, yeah, I think so. I mean, and now is probably a good time. Anyways, we've been at this for a bit of time. But yeah, game feel. Uh, there's some. It is essential to what we're doing. We're always working on game feel. We may not be thinking about things as broadly or as comprehensively as we should be, but
Mm-hmm.
every choice we make in how the game responds to the way players interact with it is definitive of what that experience is about. And so the more time we spend, or at least the more time we spend on that, the better, because we can work out the logic of what the experience is going to be. I think in many cases, the games that you're playing, some of your response to it is almost random because we overlook things when we put them together. We're thinking about what we care about, not necessarily what the audience cares about. And I know I've been guilty of that myself many times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's something that I've changed with how I look at games as well when I review them, and focusing on the overall experience and not just on 100% objective mechanics.
Yeah, that took a long time. Objective
Yes.
mechanics. That's what it was all about, by the way, 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
try to have a conversation about how it feels, and it's like everyone's just like, whatever. What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm. It's probably another discussion for that that we could jump into at some point. But I think with that, let us wrap things for tonight. Again, a 2 hour discussion on game feel. I didn't think we would get that long, but that's the again how these game design talks usually end up happening.
Yeah,
uh,
definitely.
For myself, for the new people watching, be sure to check out the Discord and Patreon link down below. Patreon subscribers will get early access to all these design talks, while the regular people will get them later on. You can follow me on Twitter at GWBlazer for my thoughts and random talks on game design there. And for you, Tomo, what are the best places people can find you at?
Um, Generally, the best place to find us is at our Discord channel, which can be found at discord.gg/Epic Tavern. We also have 3 times a week Twitch streams of development and concept design for Epic Tavern on Monday and Friday at 4 p.m. Pacific, and Wednesdays 10:30 a.m. Pacific. And you can find us on Steam, early access, Epic Tavern, available presently, and we are in the midst of trying to make our way to full release.
Nice. With that said, if you are a developer watching this, and if you are interested in coming on for either a live or recorded talk, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We're planning on doing another game dev roundtable this Saturday night. We'll see when you get the cards and the stars aligned for that. But come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where he's in the art and science of games. Have a great rest of your evening. Stay safe and all that, and we will talk to you again next time. Take care.
Hey guys.